welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Today in the show, we have David Weill. He is a pulmonary and transplant physician, and he's the author of the book, Exhale, Hope, Healing, and a Life in Transplant. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So we'll get into your book in a little bit, but first off, can you share your story and journey to where you are today?
Sure. I'm a transplant pulmonologist, so I trained in pulmonary medicine and then ultimately got interested in lung transplant and advanced lung disease. And I spent most of my career running the lung transplant program at Stanford University and also was the director of the Center for Advanced Lung Disease. I got off the front lines a few years ago and now have a transplant-related consulting business where I help transplant programs that are struggling.
So tell me some of the reasons why transplant programs are struggling across the country.
You know, Kevin, it's a wide variety of reasons. Some of them are clinical and some of them are financial and some administrative. I also work with teams regarding their own internal dynamics and about teamwork and about, these days especially, about the resiliency of the team and work-life balance. So I work with the teams in a variety of ways.
Now, as a field, lung transplant, what are some of the specific challenges facing lung transplant physicians today?
I think the majority of the challenges are trying to control an inherently uncontrollable process. So the field has moved well past its experimental phase, but there's still obviously patients that don't do well. And I think that that's the difficulty physicians caring for these patients that are facing. And in fact, the survival of lung transplant isn't quite what kidney, heart, or liver transplant is. So we deal with a field that's still rapidly evolving. And I think that that's one of the main challenges is to try to stay ahead of the learning curve.
So I hear sometimes in mainstream media about the pandemic potentially leading to lung transplant. Can you talk about how the pandemic over the last year and a little bit, how's that affected your field?
Sure. I think that there's been a lot, and I've been interviewed about the very subject. So I think there's already been around 100 lung transplants across the country for COVID-related pneumonia. Those have mainly taken place, Kevin, in the acute setting where patients are acutely ill with COVID pneumonia and they can't be weaned from the ventilator or ECMO support. There's already been 100 of those transplants performed, and I think there's going to be many more of them. But what concerns me the most is what I think is going to be a tail of lung transplants that follow after the pandemic, when many of the patients who recovered from the initial infection are going to be left with lungs that are scarred and may ultimately need a lung transplant.
All right, so let's transition into your book, and there's an excerpt on Kevin MD. The book is titled Exhale, Hope, Healing, and a Life in Transplant. Now, can you share with my audience a little bit about that book?
Yeah, so Exhale is a book that peels back the curtain of a transplant program, and I think that it would be applicable to all complex areas of medical care. I think our patients perhaps don't understand what's going on the other side of the physician-patient relationship, and I wanted to show how it feels not only from a patient perspective, the emotion of receiving a transplant, but also what it feels like to deliver that care day in and day out. And so I wanted to give readers an idea of the roller coaster that we live on.
Can you share a particularly poignant story that really illustrates some of the tribulations that you had as a transplant surgeon?
Yeah, I think that some of the stories that I write about and that I've actually excerpted on your website include those where patients who are on our waiting list simply run out of time. And these are patients that we got very close to, but died on our waiting list before they got a shot at the transplant. Having the family discussions and telling family members that their loved one is not going to get a transplant is actually probably the most difficult part of the job. Losing patients after transplant is obviously not easy either, but I think losing patients before they even get a shot at the transplant hit me particularly hard.
I talk about things like physician burnout and moral injury as themes on Kevin MD that's been going on for years now. Now, as it relates to your life as a transplant surgeon, like Where did you go for support? What kind of things did you do afterwards to kind of help you through these difficult times?
I talk a lot about when I give talks about, my career arc is talk about the three F's, family, friends, and faith. And I relied on all three to get me through some of the tough times. I think that the best thing that we can do as healthcare providers when we are struggling, and there are many out there that are struggling, is to make sure that we don't isolate ourselves. I think one tendency that I had when I was feeling down or emotionally distraught was to stick my face in a book or watch a sports game by myself. I think you should actually do the exact opposite. You need to stay connected not only to your work colleagues, but especially your family and your friends, and for those that are inclined, your faith as well.
Sometimes that places the burden of burnout on the clinician himself or herself. Now, how much of the responsibility is it on the medical institution itself to help address some of these symptoms of burnout and moral injury
Yeah.
in their healthcare staff?
No, it's a great point, one that I'm looking at pretty closely and have written about. I think that there's the tendency to think that a burned out healthcare provider has an internal problem, either an emotional or mental health issue. But I think, as your question suggests, I think that most of what I've seen out there and people that I've interacted with, it's actually due to external causes. So I'm not even crazy about the term burnout. I wish we would use another term for it, because often it's disillusionment with a healthcare system that frankly I don't think is working anymore for either patients or the providers. So I think your question's a good one.
Was there a specific event or incident that caused you to leave the front lines of transplant medicine, or was it a culmination of years of trials that led you to step away?
I think it was a culmination. It was the empathy depletion that I talk about in the book. And I think that one indication that it was time for me to step back was my inability to focus on the successes that we were having in transplanting people successfully. I tended to focus toward the end of my time at Stanford on the patients we had lost and the so-called failures, instead of focusing on the entire context of patients that we transplanted. Once I started doing that, I knew that it was probably time to step away.
We're talking to David Weill. He is a pulmonary and transplant physician and is the author of the book, Exhale, Hope, Healing, and a Life in Transplant. David, one of the things that I like is to really track the journey from clinical medicine into things outside of clinical medicine. And you mentioned you are now a consultant to transplant programs across the country. Tell me a little bit about that transition from the front lines into what you're doing now.
It happened rather seamlessly, Kevin. I had done a fair amount of work while I was at Stanford helping other transplant programs because I thought it was a great way to get back to the community. And I actually just formalized it as a business after I left Stanford. We've branched out into other things as well. I help with physician and surgical recruitments, for instance, in the transplant space. I help centers with their entire pulmonary and ICU practices now and how to set those up so that they run better. And I also serve on some boards in the transplant and pulmonary space as well, and then do a little bit on the investing side in some of the companies I'm interested in that space.
And when making that transition from clinical medicine to what you're doing now, did you have any mentors in business that helped you with that transition?
Yeah, I really didn't. I mean, it actually, some of it came fairly naturally to me, but some of it was trial and error. I would say the first year, and I would advise your listeners to really take stock during that first year out of clinical medicine to try to figure out what they do well and focus on that. And I thought program building was something that I had done well during the course of my career, so wanted to focus on that.
Do you miss clinical medicine?
I do. I do. I'd be lying to say that I didn't. I miss it, but I think that the time I get to spend with my family and friends has replaced that. So fortunately, I'm able to hear from a lot of the patients that we worked with at Stanford, and they have been wonderful, I think, in supporting me. And that interaction is incredibly meaningful to me.
Now, what would be your advice to residency programs or hospitals, medical institutions across the country to kind of prevent some, physicians to leave because of what some may call burnout or moral injury? What's your advice to these programs?
I think the first step is what's already happening out there. I think to some degree is understanding. I
Hmm.
think that when we were coming up in the field, all we were told really is just to get out there and tough it out. And that was basically the advice. I think now there's a lot more attention paid to the work-life balance among healthcare providers. And I'm convinced that that's going to pay off for the next generation of physicians, and maybe not so much for my generation of physicians, but I think the next generation will benefit from that.
And for those physicians still in clinical medicine, what's your advice to them?
I think just make sure that you carve out enough time to stay connected to the people that you care about. I think that that is absolutely key. In some of the tragedies that we've seen during the COVID crisis and before, physicians who isolated themselves are the ones that really got into trouble. And I would hate to see that. I think that it's connection. You've got to stay connected, and you've got to tell people if you're struggling. And I think that's another important message.
And my final question, what's your take-home message that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience?
Take care of yourself while you're taking care of others.
And how can people reach you?
Go to my website at davidweilmd.com. It's got my writings, my contact information, all about me.
David, thank you so much for your time and insight. And thanks again
Thanks,
for being on
Kevin.
the show.
Thanks, Kevin. Appreciate it.